a date which will live in infamy.
Never before have we had so little time in which to do so much. Yet we have this consolation with us, that the harder the sacrifice, the more glorious the triumph.
What is our aim? Victory. Victory at all costs.
We are united in detesting communist slavery. We know that the cost of freedom is high, but we are determined to preserve our freedom no matter what the cost. No matter what the cost.
And once a month we had to clean the chicken coop whether we wanted to or not. And that was just a horrible opportunity. And if you had never cleaned a chicken coop, you really need to go and do it once because it's an experience all by itself. Or go in and get some eggs and an old chicken is sitting there. It was like losing your fingers. But I had a great family life. I got 3 brothers and 4 sisters, and we just enjoyed being poor, because that's what we were when I grew up. So I think that probably did more to make me the kind of person I am today, was because we were so poor, because we had to scrape. We had to go and cut a chicken's head off and bleed it and pick the feathers and that. Otherwise, we want to eat.
US Army Sgt. Floyd Kisner was born on March 21st, 1930 in Olwine, Iowa. Floyd and his brother enlisted in the Army during the Korean War. Before this, however, Floyd and his family lived and worked in their closely knit town. The politics behind World War II had been stirring, and it was evident daily life would soon change dramatically.
We knew somewhere along the line something was going to happen, because already we were very involved in Germany with England and that. And I can vaguely remember sitting down afterwards talking to my mother and dad about it, and they said, we are a nation that can overcome anything.
Despite the quick onset, World War II took time to develop. Each week a few more men were drafted. Every month the news increased in its World War II coverage, and each year the country saw more of a war it would not forget. Floyd's family began their part by overcoming the difficulties at home. Olwine was especially influential in the war efforts of the Midwest with its connections to farm and railway infrastructure.
My hometown of Olwine was about 7,000 people at that time, and it was the hub of the Chicago Great Western Railroad, which went from Minneapolis, St. Paul to Olwine, and then it would go to Chicago, or then it would go to Kansas City. So it made it an important hub of transporting troops during the war. On a weekly basis, we had troop trains come through Olwine. We had trains with tanks and all type of artillery coming through almost daily.
Despite a modest population, the town handled a majority of the freight transport, from troop trains to tanks, moved by the Chicago Great Western Railroad. A large number of residents thus worked in connection to the railroad. Their labor reflected greatly on their community's contribution to the war effort.
In fact, even the troop trains, when they come to my hometown, the first people got off were military police, and they were armed. So there was always that concern that somebody's going to run away on them.
Rather than deserters, the troop trains far more often found the town busy farming. Iowa produced thousands of pounds of produce per acre per year. Being too young for a full-time job, Floyd and his peers worked part-time farming to contribute to the war effort. Such work was dull and paid little, but many later took great pride in serving their country with their own two hands.
Later on, I think it was probably about in 42 and 43 and 44 right there, evidently green beans was the greatest food in the world to keep our Army going. We got a call from the Chamber of Commerce that they're looking for people to help pick green beans for the Army. And so 2 cents a pound you got paid to pick beans because, again, there was no automatic machines to pick them. It was all done by hand. And that was pure torture. And a blazing hot sun, and all you could see, as far as the eye could see, was green beans growing. But I thought to myself then, now, President Roosevelt, you said things were going to be okay, but we're going to be feeding them beans?
While the Army had beans, other supplies were rationed in the U.S. as of 1942. Contrary to popular belief, rationing was instigated to control markets as much as to ease shortages. Without it, the few wealthy were wont to displace the poor in bulk purchases.
Rationing did not affect us like some people had been affected by it, just because of the size of the family and the fact that 75% plus of our food was homegrown.
In 1942, the U.S. Office of Price Administration issued 120 million copies of War Ration Book 1. The first rationed food was sugar. Red meat, coffee, flour, dairy products, and other select foods soon followed, along with 3 prime war materials: metal, rubber, and fuel. One M4 Sherman tank required 18 tons of steel, and the largest naval carriers consumed as many as 900 tons. Demand such as this put these materials at the top of the military's wish list.
And since there was 8 of us kids and mother and dad, there was 10 of us, we had more coupons than you could ever use for any of these products. So people that were hard hit, friends, mother would give them some of our coupons.
The long-term benefit of rationing was the way it taught people to make their goods last. Many families from the era share stories of stuffing tires with newspaper to avoid expensive replacements, or compiling entire recipe books using only a handful of ingredients. One inventor even debuted his innovative rail jerk to recover buried trolley lines from under city roads. "It's no good under the ground," newspapers said, "but it can smash the axis." Such sacrifice and ingenuity left strong impressions, as well as made many feel grateful for the simple pleasures in life.
The first thing I remember when my cousin Leonard come home, and he was going to stay at our house, my mother said, "What do you want to have most?" And I'll never forget this. He says, "Aunt Mabel, would you make me a angel food cake and serve it with a dill pickle?" And I looked at him, I said, "Leonard, I just want both of them so bad I'm going to eat them together." And can you imagine eating a dill pickle with angel food cake? But that I remembered very clearly. I was fortunate, and my family was fortunate. We didn't lose anybody. My dad come from a family of 14, and so there was a lot on his side that served World War II, but all have come back, thank goodness.
World War II lasted 6 years with a death toll of 60 to 80 million internationally. This figure divides almost evenly between combatant deaths, civilian deaths due to military activity, and results of famine and disease. The United States lost upwards of 400,000 service members.
Looking back with a lot of confidence and with a lot of assurance that, okay, you get the attitude, that's okay, we're going to survive.
The international status quo, however, remained tense as the famed Potsdam Conference took place between President Truman, Premier Stalin, and Prime Minister Churchill. The purpose of the conference was to decide how Allied withdrawal should proceed. The U.S. also contended with the persisting Japanese threat. Japan had controlled Korea since 1910, and after defeating them, the Americans and Soviets divided control along the 38th parallel. Both nations set up separate governments who claimed legitimacy when Japan surrendered in August of 1945. These opposed new governments, combined with building Cold War tension, thus set the stage for the Korean War. On June 25, 1950, North Korea, supported by the Soviet Union and China, stormed the 38th parallel and marked the beginning of the Korean War. Within 2 months, the South Korean forces were depleted and UN forces, a majority being American, interfered. Meeting these troop demands was the Selective Service Act of 1948, a simple renewal of the World War II draft in face of the Cold War.
Later, 1950, I was due to be drafted because during the Korean War, the draft was still going on from World War II. And I got notified I was due to be drafted. But my mother, in all her kindness and sweetness, she said, "Floyd, you're more outgoing than my brother John, who's a year younger. Why don't you two join together and you could stay together?" "Okay, Mom, whatever." And so we joined for 3 years. We were together exactly 5 days in our 3 years. Well, the worst part about it, when we went in, he had high blood pressure and never knew it. And he's in the table there, and I said, "What's going on with John?" And the doctor came out, he says, "He's got high blood pressure, we can't let him in." "Oh, yes, you're going to let him in. Cure his blood pressure. You let him in. Otherwise, you don't let me in because I'm in here because of him." And they put him in, they let him in. I was going to make the best I could out of the 3 years. I took my mother's wonderful advice. She says, "I want you to promise me several things." Okay. Number one, always try to get to church. My mother was, you had to be death warmed over before you didn't go to church. So, good old Sacred Heart. She says, I don't want you to ever argue about your religion. Unless it's wrong. Then you can, but don't argue. And don't argue politics. I thought that was funny. We never had politics to speak of. And so I took that great advice. And so during those 3 years in the service, I was at Camp McCoy, Wisconsin for my basic training. I was an instructor for a while, and I made the mistake of telling a National Guard captain to keep his mouth shut in my class, and so I got shipped to Korea. Our company was sent to Kogito. Kogito was our island for prisoners, and evidently over the years the prisoners dug underground and developed their own little community. And so it was time for the United States to take it back in control because they couldn't enforce anything without inviting injury to the guards and so forth. So they hauled our tank battalion down there.
The Prime Minister of North Korea, Kim Il-sung, had a simple objective: race the UN to the southern edge of the Korean peninsula. If he could secure South Korea before the UN gained a foothold, he could use his communist, Chinese, and Soviet support to remain unchallenged in Korea. If he hesitated, the U.S., through the UN, would advance the containment of communism in Southeast Asia. The blitzkrieg that ensued began June 25, 1950, and ended on August 4, 1950. In less than 3 months, the North Korean People's Army advanced 165 miles and drove UN forces alarmingly deep into South Korea. There was even subtle talk of the U.S. arming several nuclear weapons for the occasion. Before going so far, however, the UN made a stand at the Pusan perimeter. Here, UN forces numbered 140,000 and held out against 98,000 members of the North Koreans for 6 weeks. At this point, Douglas MacArthur launched an invasion at Incheon, a port city west of Seoul, and divided the People's Army. The rapid reversal of fortunes allowed the UN to drive the North Koreans back north to the 38th parallel. MacArthur's victories, however, created over 130,000 North Korean POWs in the mere 3 months. The UN moved to isolate the island of Kogito, a 150 square mile island along the southern coast of South Korea. 4 enclosures, each subdivided into 8 compounds, were built within the 2 rock-strewn valleys along the northern coast. Each of the 32 original compounds was designed to hold between 700 and 1,200 POWs. Each was quickly filled to 5 times this capacity. Resentment between North and South Koreans allowed many incidents to escalate to physical conflict. The American security forces, most of which knew little or no Korean, were reluctant to intervene. This bitterness, as well as that of rival communist and anti-communist POW groups, escalated many times to large-scale conflicts. On December 8, 1951, horrific rock fights killed 14 inmates and made casualties of 24 others. A skilled trade instruction program instituted the same year to keep POWs busy profitably taught many prisoners metalworking. This gave them the skill and resources to build more sophisticated weapons, including knives and spears. The increasing resistance among POWs was striking. One compound, Compound 62, sealed itself off and refused to be served or screened by security and demanded to return to North Korea. In response, the 3rd Battalion of the 27th Infantry Regiment of the US Army was brought in. With fixed bayonets and weapons ready, they entered and divided the compound into 4 sections. The inmates ultimately refused to stand down and assaulted the infantry with knives, axes, picks, stones, and other homemade weapons. The infantry opened fire and the short barrage immediately killed 55 inmates. 22 succumbed to injuries days later. 1 infantryman was killed and 38 wounded against the 77 communists killed and 140 wounded. Despite their losses, the communists succeeded in remaining independent as the infantry immediately withdrew. Compound 76, however, was the true communist leader. The inmates of Compound 76, over the course of several months, dug extensive underground tunnels linking it to 4 other compounds. With Compound 76 acting as a base of operations, the North Koreans coordinated the capture of the camp commander, U.S. General Francis T. Dodd, on May 7, 1952. They aimed to secure UN proclamations of neglect and mistreatment against the POWs. Negotiations were finalized in 3 days, and the North Koreans received their political compensation, much to the embarrassment of the UN. 1 month later, the newly instated camp commander, General Hayden Boatner, sought to formalize control of the camp by bringing in tanks from the 64th Heavy Tank Battalion, along with members of the 187th Regimental Combat Team.
And our colonel being in the same category as Patton was in World War II, he made some slight demands that were not followed, and so he managed with some of the tanks to blow up a portion of the underground hideout of these prisoners, and so needless to say, they came out.
As troops filed into Compound 76, inmates ambushed them with sheet metal spears and flails made from barbed wire. Even when the tank battalion moved in, the fighting continued for another 2 hours. 43 POWs died, along with 139 wounded, while the 187th lost 1 member with 13 others wounded. With the final removal of the inmates of Compound 76, the entire section of the camp was inspected. Troops found 4,500 knives, 3,000 spears, 1,000 Molotov cocktails, and 1 operational telegraph set. Deeper within the underground section of the compound, they discovered shallow graves as well as bodies thrown into wells, victims of the prisoners' so-called people's courts. Most disturbingly, documents detailing a mass breakout and hostile takeover of the entire camp were discovered. Whether the goal was to simply reap vengeance against perceived wrongs or to negotiate transport to the north is unknown. The date for the operation read June 20th, a scant 10 days away.
And then we went back up to the front lines. Here's a case where our people that were supposed to be guarding them, they went through heck, because these people had dug these tunnels underneath the ground, and they just had holes where they'd come out once in a while to be counted, or they got so they wouldn't. And if they looked down in there, somebody stuck them in the face with a spear or something. And to see what transpired to correct that was very memorable. And there's so many interesting stories in Korea, how the colonel had 2 ducks, and those ducks could do whatever they want. If they come in your tent and decided it was time to leave something, they'd leave it, and you could do nothing about it. And then one day somebody shot him. I was out hunting. Oh, what a catastrophe that was. So I spent better part of 2 weeks in Korea with my Jeep driver trying to find 2 new ducks for the colonel. And we paid quite a bit of money for 2 of the ugliest things I've ever, but he was satisfied he had his 2 ducks. See, in the Korean War, you had to develop so many points. Each month you were there, you got 2 points. And so you had to have 18 or 20, or I don't remember anymore, points. And then if they could find a replacement, you got rotated. But my job as battalion sergeant major at that time was to find replacements when somebody was eligible. And I got to meet this marvelous, marvelous gentleman, and he was due to rotate, but I couldn't get a replacement. And he used to show me the picture of his 3 beautiful children, brag about them, and that, oh, how marvelous. And I could never find one. And I told him, I says, you know, in about 20 some days, down to date, you can get to go home. Oh. 5 days later, I got a telephone call. He was dead. He was back in it. It was dark at night, and of course they don't have no lights on. Cold, icy. Slipped on the ice, and the tank ran over him. So my job was when anybody got killed, not only did the colonel write a letter, but I had to write a letter on behalf of, as an enlisted man. And I bet it took me 2 weeks to try to figure out, well, what am I going to say in this letter to this guys? So that was probably the hardest thing, period, that I had to do in the service. I don't know, they won't use this, but we had this fabulous young man from Philadelphia, a black gentleman, Bob. Oh, he was such a great guy, but he had a bad habit. And he had this horrible sex drive. And so every once in a while he'd crawl under the barbed wire fencing and then sneak back in before the guards come by, you know, on patrol. One night about midnight, all of a sudden I hear, Sergeant Kisner, Sergeant Kisner. And I woke up, I thought, well, who's calling me? And I realized it's outside. And I go out to the back of the tent, and it's him on the other side of the fence. I says, what's wrong? Well, for the rice paddies, all the human waste net is discharged into these honey pots or whatever they call them. Well, he fell in one. Oh, you cannot imagine what we went through for a month. We soaked him in boiling hot water. We put bleach in the water because we couldn't get rid of this odor. And when he left on rotation, he still smelled. He almost became, excuse the expression, a white man. Because all the bleach that we put in there, this guy's skin, it got in the pores. It was so bad. When he come up and worked in that building that we were set up at to operate, you couldn't stand him. But so I don't know whatever happened to him when he got back to the States. But it was it was funny at the time, but then you felt sorry for him, but he got what he deserved, as they say, back then and there.
When examining both the North and South Koreans' response to the war, it is important to note how each faction responded in the way they thought best. The UN could be seen as crusaders combating a dictator or a foreign menace interfering with a divided homeland's concerns. Military measures used on both sides, from the UN's napalm to the Koreans' POW conduct, gave each side reason to pause. In the middle of the chaos of the war, it is remarkable how experiences are shared despite, and arguably because of, the intense opposition presented in wartime life.
Met some real wonderful people. That was one of the great things that I think you meet people that you never would have met in your life, who you become just like brothers. The colonel, he became just like a father away from home, because if you had any problems or anything, you could talk. So I just think, and plus the experience of being in and seeing the people. Yes, they were always trying to make money off of you, but what could you expect? I mean, they had nothing to speak of, and so by trying to sell you some jacket or some cup or something for $1, you know, that meant something to them, you know. And I think just the fact that I was able to get on the boat and come home, you know, because there was a lot of them that didn't happen. And I come back without any injuries or something like that. That was very important. Probably learning that you must adjust no matter how difficult the situation is or the condition that you find yourself. You have to listen to people and take directions and not do your own. For instance, like when we had, I could just imagine today if they said that we're going to practice an air raid, how many people would even listen or pay attention? See, the big thing I see today as I grew older is back then I didn't care who you are. When there was a problem, they worked together to solve it. And I think that was the great aspect of World War II is, as a nation, we really, for the first time, really come together and got to understand each other. But I just think that we learned then that we as a nation can overcome a challenge if we just put our foot down and work together. When I got back, when I got stationed at Fort Belvoir, I was called into the general's office, and shortly after President Eisenhower gave his inaugural address, first thing he says, there will be no more separation of soldiers. I mean, in other words, you had still then, and that would be in '54, you had all black battalions, black companies, all white. You got overseas, that never happened. That happened. So General Scott called me and says, I want you to sign the next 10 white soldiers into B Company, 74, 84, something like that, battalion. And I said to him, General, that's all black. And I says, okay. So about 2 weeks later, here comes the guy. He says, I got 10 people out here for you to assign. And so I had the privilege, if you want to call it, to tell these 10 boys, young boys, and most everybody then was young boys, like myself, that you were going to be taken over and installed in company. And they knew right away. I was called every name that the Lord created. You know, I said, I apologize. There's nothing I can do about it. It's my job. And so I did. And of course, thank goodness, within a month, another 400 went in there, so they were almost even. And as fate would have it, I'm walking down the hall at Milwaukee School of Engineering. I hear this guy call out, Sergeant Kisner, you son of a... I thought, who is that? And I turned around, and I had been maybe 2 years so that I never saw him. And there was Ted Salkowski, one of those 10 boys. We became very close friends afterwards. In fact, I was involved when he got married and godchild and everything else involved. But how fate would have it that you ended up part of doing history, then 2 years later, one of them. And I would imagine for years if I'd have met any of the other ones on the street, I would have known them. Because I could, just the expression in their face. You can't even imagine how they looked at you.
this is challenging, or it was anyway, this entire documentary, just because I'm so used to not being very personable about really much of anything. And it, of course, extends easily to school, because you do math, you work on papers, you turn in assignments, you go about your day, and that's that. What you think of, it's your business. And so it's been very different in this class to have something where what you personally think about things and your experiences directly impact what you're doing, because there is no right answer. You end up with, at the end of the year, on the last day when you submit your documentary, whatever you put into it. And so if, for this class, if you really want to learn anything, you have to put into it. You get what you put in. And so you really do have to adapt and adjust in order to make a very good documentary, because you're making this not for points or for a class, you're making it for another person who has done more and seen more than you can even think of, and yet all you have to work with is your experience. And so I think for this class, it's good for anyone who wants or needs to learn to adjust and to do something new and to challenge themselves to a very high degree, because that's exactly what I got out of it, and I'm certainly glad. That's why I signed up way back last year. It was just because I was filling out a tough schedule, but then I was delighted to find that the things I was looking for, a challenging schedule, something new that I had never done before, those are the things that I found Mr. Kisner talking about in his raw footage in his interview. And that was phenomenal to me, just that, just like the teachers said would happen, every year students tend to choose veterans to make documentaries on with whom they identify with. And it's very fascinating to watch, because even the students can see it. And so I think with, doing something out of the box, that it's been great. My end documentary is nothing about what I thought it might be at the beginning, because I didn't know in the beginning. So, until you turn it in on that last day, you don't know what you're going to end up with. And I think that's the best part about this class, and that you are adapting every second of the way until you are truly done.